Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to this talk on Friday afternoon. I appreciate you being here. My name is Sevi Marshall. I work at digital agency Canada, which is based just down the road in the city centre in Norwich. We produce websites, we create websites, do all the branding, design and production, and also do some work on SEO. What I'm going to talk about today is about diversity in tech and exactly kind of defining what diversity is, what it looks like in the tech industry, and then I'm going to explore some of the main challenges in the industry and look at some of the main structural challenges. I'm not only going to face you with the main problems around diversity, I also want to give you a few more solid pieces of advice in terms of some of the solutions that you can take away with you and can apply in practice as well. So looking at some of those more grassroots solutions. Before I go any further into talking about diversity itself, which, as we all know, is a very important topic, I'm going to give you a little bit more introduction to myself. So, like I said, I'm a project manager at Canada, but I haven't always been a project manager. I was actually born in Uzbekistan, and if anyone knows where Uzbekistan, does anyone know where Uzbekistan is? One person, two people, fantastic, three people, maybe four, no, okay, just four people, great. Good start. So Uzbekistan is in Central Asia. It's a very small country, but it's also really multicultural because it lies between a couple of continents, so Asia and Europe as well. So it's got a really nice mix of Uzbek, Russian, and Western cultures in one place. So from a very young age, I had the benefit of interacting with loads of different people at once. My parents, for some reason, decided to put me through a really rigorous education program where I was essentially learning 3 languages at once. So I was learning Uzbek, Russian, and German at the same time. So by the age of 10, I somehow managed to speak all 3. I definitely don't anymore, so please don't think that I'm that smart. But unfortunately, the one language they didn't decide to teach me was English, which I definitely needed when we flew. We decided to fly 8,000 kilometres across the world and create a new life in England and in Norfolk. So as a newbie to the country, it was quite a shock to my system. I will admit that. It was quite a bit of a cultural shock. One of the things that three of the things that I really struggled with were, of course, the language, the humour, I will admit. I didn't quite catch on so immediately, and gravy. Gravy was a really weird one. I don't know why, but it took me 10 years to get my head around it, but you will be pleased to know that I have it regularly now. But being exposed to so many different cultures and learning all these different languages, it just made me aware of all the differences that we can experience between cultures and between different people who speak different languages, and also what it felt like to stick out like a sore thumb, and that's exactly how I felt at different points in my life. So when I came to the UK, obviously I had to learn English really, really quickly and put all my input, myself into it. And I also decided to do the same with my studies. And I studied my arse off for about 12 years until I made it to Cambridge, where I did my Masters in Development Studies. And for anyone who doesn't know, development studies is it's a subsection of economics, essentially, where you get to learn why some countries develop better than others and get to really analyse that a lot further. And when I was doing development studies, I came across a really weird nuance around this idea of economic development, which is around how having a more diverse workforce or group of people or even organisations in a country is actually really beneficial for the development of that country. And in theory, diversity has a very direct correlation with financial benefit and financial growth. And this idea really struck me because I've always thought diversity was something that was more altruistic rather than something that actually made capitalistic or financial sense. But that idea really stuck in the back of my mind for a long time. But anyway, so I decided for some reason to put that in the back of my head and actually try and move up the career ladder for a little while. And that's when I came into project management in the digital world. And I absolutely love project management. Anyone who knows me knows that I really, really enjoy it for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it feeds my constant need for adrenaline. I love doing loads of different things at once. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. But the second reason is because as a project manager, you're exposed to loads of different people and loads of different environment, situations and projects at once. So you get to see all the exciting things that are happening across a load of diverse groups of people, but also you get to see some of the problems, and that's something that I've been picking up a lot more regularly in the past couple of years whilst I've been working in digital. So you can see that from my personal background, that diversity is something that's really struck a particular chord with me. Considering where I was born, how I came to the country, my studies, and obviously what I do now. But diversity for me, I think, is starting to go beyond that, especially in the work that I do around producing digital services and digital products. And it's really focusing on this idea how a lack of diverse teams or companies that are not very diverse are actually starting to affect the products that we create in tech. And the fact that they're not necessarily accommodating to the needs of everyone in the population. And if you consider that only a minute proportion of the entire population is making these tech products, but the majority of the world now has access to the internet and is using them, that means that we have some level of responsibility in actually representing their needs and values. So here's an example of what I mean. Have anyone seen this video before? Maybe, yeah. So you're going to see in this video two people trying to use an automated soap dispenser. So this person, you can see, is struggling to do that, and the second person has no problem. Again, let's try that again, maybe just for good measure. No problem. Okay, so we can see over here that these two people, the main difference between them isn't necessarily hand temperature or anything like that is going to trigger the sensor. It's their skin color. So somewhere along the line, the testing process didn't necessarily facilitate the needs of people with darker skin colors. And that's not to say that people in tech are evil and not considering the needs of everyone out there, but it's just a little bit of unconscious oversight that we're sometimes practicing in the industry and need to start overcoming. So more on that a little bit later, but before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit more what diversity actually is so that we can have a little bit more understanding about it. I do tend to find that diversity is quite a saturated term, so that after a while we start mixing it up with things like inclusivity, equity, equality, etc. But just for the basis of this discussion, I want you to think about diversity through a tiered approach. So really thinking about the notion of inclusion, first of all. So including as many voices and opinions and experiences in one situation, organisation as possible. Secondly, it's about contribution. So really enabling as many people as possible to enter that conversation. And that's different from inclusion because you have to think about how can we open the door or create that stepping stone for men as much as women to be able to come enter those conversations that are really making a difference. And finally, it's about representation and really thinking, how are the people who are sat at the decision-making table representing different groups or different segments of the population? So how are they representing people from various backgrounds, men, women, people from different economic situations as well? So you can see that it's quite multifaceted and it's got a lot of layers, and it's something that I want to bear in mind. But the thing that I want to think about the most is this idea of contribution and representation, because it seems that in tech this is where we're particularly falling behind. In terms of diversity and why it's important, like I mentioned earlier, it is now starting to go beyond altruism for anyone who thought otherwise, and that in reality it really does make financial sense for companies to be more diverse in their workforce, and especially in their senior management teams. So you can look from the data that I collated from McKinsey, Harvard Business Review and Weber Shandwick. The companies who have more diverse teams and management teams are 35% more likely to outperform their competitors, which is quite a significant amount. Also, diverse management teams lead to approximately 19% higher revenue, and that's data from Harvard Business Review. And finally, approximately half of millennials that were surveyed in this particular study noted that diversity in the workplace is something that they're looking for in particular as they look for the next phase to be working in or base themselves for the next few years. So we can really see that diversity isn't just important for our generations, but it's also something that's starting to make sense for companies to remain competitive in the future and to be able to attract the necessary talent to keep afloat. And as you saw earlier, diversity is also about representing user needs. If we're not including a diverse set of people in our teams that are producing certain products and services, then we're not necessarily going to accommodate to a more diverse user base. And this has been particularly noted online, some articles that I've been able to find, and there's so many out there, but these are some really common examples. And a lack of diversity is starting to increase the risk of tech product failures, and inevitably this is only going to affect our profit margins and just how the success rate of our projects and overall motivation amongst teams. Ignoring diversity is hurting tech products and ventures. It's been a reported phenomenon over and over again that diversity within those teams isn't being considered carefully enough and is therefore only increasing failure in projects. And finally, there's a few examples of where diversity can be brought in amongst different stages of a project, so not just at the very end of a project during testing, like you saw with the example of the automated soap dispenser, but also during initial ideation and UX research, like you see from this article example. So today I'm going to focus on the challenges of diversity through the lens of structural challenges. Initially, I was going to look at structural, cultural, and semantic challenges just because this is a framework that I found online from a peer-reviewed article, and I thought, oh, fantastic, I can finally create a lens for all these ideas that are floating around in my head. And then I completed the talk, I wrote everything up, I recorded myself, and I realised I'd been talking for over an hour, which I don't think anyone wants on a Friday afternoon, so I've cut it right down for your benefit and mine, and just going to focus on structural for today. And before we do that, I just want to make sure that you understand the definition of what I mean by structural. So when we're looking at structural challenges, it's really understanding the collective obstacles which affect one group from being able to achieve a particular outcome over another. So it's really thinking about that boardroom example that I gave you earlier. What are the obstacles that are coming in the way of women being able to move their way up to the C-suite exec level compared to men, especially in tech companies, and thinking around some of those main obstacles. And in order to understand those challenges, I think it's key for you to have a better overview of the entire industry and to actually understand where we're standing at this point. So just to give you some headline data, we can see that approximately 5 million of the UK population is now working in tech, and that figure is only going to increase, especially as we start to stretch tech and tech production into vertical industries. Approximately 75% of the sector is male, and I can look around the room and say I think the majority of the audience at the moment is male as well, and I've noticed that in the conference, and hopefully that figure is only starting to improve as we move forward. But some of the more shocking statistics are around BAME contribution, especially at senior level within companies. Approximately 2.6% of UK technology company board members are BAME members, which is quite problematic because I believe that about 18% of the overall population is comprised of BAME individuals. And only 9% of tech professionals have a disability, whereas we're looking at approximately a fifth of the overall population having some sort of disability or accessibility needs. So in many instances, we're not representing the cross-section of the overall UK population at the very least, especially with the statistics when we're looking at the male and female apportionment within the industry. And that's the sort of statistics that I want to focus on a little bit more, because realistically, that's where my passion lies, being a woman, I hope you can tell, and also that it's just something that I think that is predominantly shocking when you are looking at those stats and data that isn't really improving that quickly. But the good news is that whilst the UK sucks at including women in tech now, we're not the only country that is in that situation. We also have friends in Australia, in Spain, and the United States that only represent about 20% of their tech workforce as being female, compared to approximately a 50-50 split in terms of gender divides in the overall working labour workforce. Moving on, you can also see from research by McKinsey that the contribution and involvement of women in tech is only reducing as you start looking higher and higher up the career ladder. With women from a white background, you can see that reduction is quite natural and potentially they'll be starting to look elsewhere. but it's particularly bad when you look at the statistics of women of colour who are being retained within the industry, especially at those higher levels, and fewer instances compared to women from white backgrounds. And of course, this is a statistic that gets to me so much every time I look at it. It's around the gender pay gap. The tech industry average gender pay gap is higher than the UK average. It's currently at 16% on average, whereas in the UK it's 11.6. And whilst there is a green bubble around the UK average, in no way am I connotating that as a good thing. And please, let's change that. Okay, so just going back to talking about the main challenges and moving away from those overview statistics. If you want to look at the structural challenges, another good way to start understand the lens of structural challenges again is just split them up into three main categories. I love putting things into boxes as a project manager because it just helps me to make sense of the world, but because also diversity is such a broad topic, I think it's a nice way for a lot of people to understand the problem a lot faster. So today I'm going to talk about three main structural challenges. The first one is attracting people to the industry and making sure that the stereotypes around tech are not pushing people away. The second one is educating and being able to retain people within the education pipeline, or at least give them equitable opportunities to learn certain technical skill sets, or to be involved within the industry. And the third one is about retention. Once you've been able to attract them and educate them, how do you make sure that you're retaining talent, especially from women and minority groups? So I'm going to start looking at attracting first. So attracting diverse groups. The main questions that I want you to start thinking about when you are considering how we're attracting people to the industry is how we come across to outsiders. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've only been in the industry for a couple of years, so I can remember quite clearly how I felt about the industry before joining. It felt like a very daunting space, and it felt like I had to be someone who was very proficient in a more technical role, like programming, for example, to be someone who could blend in. And also thinking, so it leads me on to the topic about rethinking stereotypes in tech and just understanding whether that's necessarily true and whether we are reflecting that in the way that we're positioning ourselves to people outside of tech. And that's the question that's kind of been researched recently and explored a little bit further, especially at higher education level. Universities are now starting to recognize by just advertising these computer science courses, for example, or courses that are more focused on engineering and something very, very technical, is not really helping to attract more women, for example, or people from minority backgrounds, because it is perpetuating this idea of the stereotype of something that's far scarier than it actually is. And one of the ways that local institution UEA is trying to overcome this is to combine the computing science course with a more creative element by creating a merged bachelor's of computing and creative technologies. And this is something that is starting to appeal to more women out there, more girls and women who want to take part in the higher education with a bit more of a creative element. Now, it's really interesting because I actually wrote this slide a few weeks ago and I put it on there, and then I think it was about a week ago, I spoke to someone at CodeBar. CodeBar is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's an international charity that gives access to programming lessons and mentorships for anyone from a minority background. And I attended a workshop last week, and there was a girl there who attended and told me that she was actually completing the Creative Technologies course. And I thought, this is such a weird coincidence, and I absolutely have to ask you, do you think, is there a bigger uptake of women in the course than you would find in the computer sciences? And she completely agreed without any sort of hesitation that it absolutely is. And I think it's giving people an opportunity just to relax a bit more and to also take part in something that isn't just so stringently technical, and just to practice them a bit more with creative flair, whilst also learning the harder technical graft that we need in the industry. The second challenge from a structural point of view is about education, and something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more continuously, which is the STEM pipeline. And I'll explain a little bit more what that is in a second. So when we're thinking about the structural challenges with regard to education, it's quite important to think about the retention gap in the STEM pipeline and how we can reduce that over time. and also really interrogating this idea of why people are leaving at certain points in the education pipeline and focusing a little bit more closely at those reasons. So for anyone who hasn't heard of the STEM pipeline, this is what it is. This is a visualized version of it, and it's something that's referred to quite a lot in peer-reviewed research papers that I've been able to come across. And in this particular instance, and in this case study, you can see that a study in America found that approximately 4 million ninth graders had some sort of interaction with a STEM subject back in 2001. And over time, as this cohort made their way through the education pipeline, moving from ninth grade to high school, and then to college, and then through to completing their university degrees, only 167,000 of those students graduated in some sort of STEM subject. And of course, that isn't a guarantee that they then took part in the workforce in some sort of STEM role. And where you want to start really focusing on this information is around this lovely image of the leakages in the pipeline, and thinking, what's happening there? Why are people leaving? Why? Of course, you're never going to get 4 million people stay in the education pipeline and enter the workforce, but it seems to be quite a significant number of people that are deciding to leave. And I had a very interesting conversation with someone recently who completed a computer science course at university, and told me that out of a cohort of approximately 100 people, that her and her female colleagues or peers only made up about 10 students of the overall cohort. And that left to some feelings of feeling sometimes a bit nervous or just not very comfortable going to lectures. They even went as far as agreeing to meet up before lectures and go into the lecture halls together because they just didn't want to stick out so much on their own. And it's really reflecting some of those feelings of being quite daunted and maybe just not that comfortable actually going to these courses, which of course can perpetuate into something much, much bigger over time. And that just gives you a little bit of a taster as to why these points, or actually refer to this and that, are starting to happen. And that's only one example out of absolutely dozens, which is quite nicely visualized over here when you start looking at the career progression pipeline. So data like this just shows you that there's so many barriers to progression that women and people from minority backgrounds face, especially as they make their way through education and start entering a career in tech. So if we go back to the tertiary education example, that things like bias, discrimination, and harassment play an important role in standing as a barrier to progression for women to be able to proceed as a STEM graduate. And then as you enter your early and mid-career, there's a whole host of other barriers that continue to take place. So it just shows you that doesn't stop at university level, that continues far beyond. And it's quite scary because when I look at some of those barriers to progression, detail around those, I definitely can note that it's not something that I've really experienced myself. There's been maybe a couple smaller instances, but nowhere to the extent of some what I can see over there, especially with regards to tertiary education. Like I studied economics and business, and discrimination, harassment, and bias weren't really things that I came across in my cohort because there were quite a few women as well as men. So the third challenge, which is around retention, or the third structural challenge, which is around retention, is really thinking about if we're able to tackle this idea of keeping women and people from minority backgrounds within the STEM pipeline, how can we then retain them within the industry going forward? So really understanding when and why people are leaving, and inquiring about that a little bit more, and thinking about the ways that we can compete beyond salary. There are instances where in the industry, salaries are becoming quite serious to some people, and of course that's fantastic and I completely encourage that, but at some point smaller companies need to start thinking about the ways that they can compete beyond the money and sometimes start aligning with some of the modern values that people would like to see in their employer. So again, looking at the data, especially with regard to women, you can see that from this particular study that was completed on a global level, this study found that 75% of women noted that they're going to leave their current employer within the next 5 years. And this is based in tech, of course, and the surrounding notes around the Boston Consultancy Group report of this did mention that they were either going to leave for another tech company company or actually leave the industry entirely. And some of the most common reasons why women have been noted to leave their current tech companies have been around weak management support, a lack of opportunities, and a lack of work-life balance. So clearly something's not being met there, and it's forcing women to not only leave their current employers, but to just exit the industry and look for something that's going to align with their values better. And this particular point about lack of work-life balance really sticks with me. As I mentioned a few times, and this diagram, again, just going back to the BCG report, shows you that work-life balance has stayed at the very top of the value chain for people in 2018 and in 2020, so before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and it's something that stays a priority to this date. And looking at these stats, you can see that things like a good relationship with colleagues and financial compensation are only going up higher in the value chain for women in the workplace. And what that data says to me when I look at it as a woman is that there's a greater desire for women to have greater agency and autonomy in the workplace. They're looking for a little bit more freedom, and that's something that as employers need to start reflecting more. Okay, so that's a lot of information, it's a lot of diagrams and data. So what the hell do you know about it all? I completely appreciate that in terms of where we are in the country, in the world, sometimes we don't have too much to work with in terms of being able to have a really inclusive and diverse workforce. But just because you're in Norfolk doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything about it, that you should go away from this talk and just forget about it entirely. So don't be like a boomer and just go end on please. In the first instance, of course, you can be a digital ally, but potentially that's not quite enough. There's a few more things that you can do yourself at a more grassroots level that will help to open up opportunities and help to overcome those structural barriers that I just explored. So going back to the notion of attracting, educating, and retaining. So thinking about attracting, in theory, what we can do is we can open up opportunities to companies to welcome industry newbies. Okay? You can open up the fourth wall, if you like it, and invite onlookers and outsiders to have a peek inside and understand what's going on in there and decide for themselves if it's something that they're interested in. You can also start mixing creativity with more technical roles to appeal to a wider crowd, not necessarily in the job description if there's something that doesn't suit you, but at least in workshops where people can have a look up, into the company, into the industry, and maybe they'll recognize some interest. So some more practical examples include opening up work placements in-house for people from local sixth forms and local high schools to come and experience what it's like to work in an agency or in-house within a marketing or digital department and find out exactly what it's like and make up their own mind as to whether it's something they want to continue in the future, rather than just basing their ideas around tech from the news flashes they see that sometimes causes a lot of fear-mongering, or TV programs like Mr. Robot, I think that's another one. You can also start creating open days for local charities and societies, which will then do a lot of the work for you and spreading this idea that working in a digital company isn't that scary, and actually it's quite an inclusive open space and people who work in tech are really lovely as well. They're not necessarily excluding anyone on purpose, they actually do want to open up the space for others. And of course, facilitating technical workshops with more of a creative theme. I think that's a really fun way to start including people who are younger as well and people from a more diverse background. Secondly, looking at this notion of education, you can start also by subsidising learning in more technical skills, or at the very least supporting organisations which provide some sort of subsidisation or a place for people to go and learn a more technical role, and also setting up mentorship networks between senior and junior staff, or at the very least between yourselves and your wider network. So an example of how you can facilitate some of those grassroots solutions with education in mind is thinking about how you can hire more junior roles and potentially put them through a little bit of a course or a little bit of a program that's created in-house, or get them to a very particular point where they aim to be. Or even bringing someone who is at a very entry point to the industry overall and agreeing with them that you will get them from A to B within 6 months or 12 months or however long, as long as they're the right person to join the company and fit in with the culture. And finally, retention and how we can retain more people in the industry. And I think this is a really interesting one because it very much depends on the kind of company you're from, or whether you work for yourself, or the environment that you're in day to day. But ultimately, we want to recognise modern values and be as open about this as possible. And also interrogate management support in some ways. And I put this word down and someone gave me some feedback. It sounded like really harsh. Like you want to put someone in a room and flash a light in their face and interrogate how they're managing people. But what I mean by that is actually understanding and maybe doing a little bit of background work to look at how are women or people from underrepresented groups being managed differently, potentially to their male counterparts, or someone who is a little bit more dominant in the company. And of course, fair promotion accountability. So making yourself accountable within your company to provide fair promotion opportunities for people as much as possible. So a few practical examples include involving employees in conversation around the future nature of work. So this is something that I took part in a few months ago and I found it to be massively beneficial. Even if it's something that you don't see a huge amount of results from in your companies, at the very least you are involved in the conversation. Recently I was part of a conversation where we were talking about a 4-day working week, and that's something that really appeals to me, and I was able to justify why I think that's really useful for myself and the things that I like to do in the background. But there's so many other things and nuances that can be brought up as part of that conversation that potentially employers aren't able to recognise from their perspective. And in terms of being accountable for fair promotion, you can think about implementing promotion structures through personal development plans and any similar plans as such, where you can give people a bit of a clearer path of how they can get to a Z. Okay, so in summary, diversity is multi-layered. There's so much going on. There's so much that you can take away from what diversity is around as a topic. But at the very core of it, in terms of what you should really focus on with regards to tech, is thinking about the idea of representation and enabling people to be part of the conversation and part of the industry. There's 3 main structural challenges that we're currently facing, and it's based on research and data, and it is very much around attracting people to the industry, making it less of a scary place to be, about educating them, and allowing them to stay within that education STEM pipeline, and also potentially subsidising some of that education for people who can't afford it, and therefore see that as a big barrier to entry into the industry. And around retention, understanding what modern values are within your company or the places that you work in, and starting to reflect that within your policies in the workplace. And some of the most effective solutions take place at the grassroots level. And I think that's a really key takeaway from today, that diversity often happens in a conversation at such a high level. It's a conversation that happens within governments, within councils and think tanks, and it's a high-level conversation with high-level solutions. But at the very end, there are small changes that you have the agency to be able to implement on your own, as companies, as employers, as freelancers, and such, to help attract, educate, and retain more people in the industry. And I think I have a little bit of time for questions for anyone who has any questions. Yes?
You talked a lot about what companies can do.
Yes.
But do you have any advice on what employees can do?
Yeah, of course. I think that one of the things that employees can start doing is actually maybe identifying if there's anyone in their company who wants to upskill. So if there's someone who is in a supporting or operational role who wants to learn something a little more technical, and giving them a little bit of guidance, so the idea of mentorship can be brought back into the equation. And sometimes it can be as easy as raising that with a manager or a director or someone that is a little bit higher up, just to flag there is some interest out there, but it's just not being brought up into the open. So I think that's a really good starting point. Any other questions?
Do you have something sort of get very ratty when you talk about the pipeline?
Yeah.
And do you have an answer to it? It seems to me any company trying to recruit more from adults is just getting a different share of it. It seems to me that having more in for everyone's share is more important. So why is pipeline such a dirty word for some people?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you. I feel like sometimes when you are looking at really high level data, it can be quite skewed. and it's not always representative of what's actually happening behind the scenes. But are you talking specifically around education of adults?
No, about getting youngsters through into the industry.
Yeah.
There seems to be an argument that that's kind of ignoring a big issue with there not being enough being done when people are already there.
Yeah.
It's like it's an either or, and I just don't understand the objection.
I think it's about focusing on which area of the industry you're focusing on. Are you looking at the people who are coming into the industry from the very start, from the point where they're starting to interact with the STEM subject, which is at school, or whether you're looking at people who are participating and who are about to leave and anything. So there's a need for potentially a change of focus or a bit of contextualization in that regard. But I think at this point we are talking about entry into a STEM career, into the STEM industry. The pipeline, it just gives you a little bit of a good overview of what's going on and where the issues are. So in some of those debates, and I've actually come across some of them myself, it's interesting because I think they do tend to try and shy away from conversation about the pipeline and use some of that data, but it's very much about thinking about who's coming into the industry and then having a separate conversation about retention and what's actually happening within tech itself, which is what I'm coming with as well. Thank you. Anyone else at all? Thank you very much. Enjoy your time.